Afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our webinar on assisting towns and regions looking to diversify some of their agricultural resources into agri-food-based experiences. So I'm Nicole Price, and I'm from the Clean Growth Choices Consortium, and I'll be hosting today's webinar. So this webinar is actually the second in a series of webinars that's been presented as part of the Communities and Transitions program. So for those of you who are not familiar with that project, it's a Queensland government funded program and it involves 6 regional communities, and they're exploring what the future may hold for them and possible opportunities to help them transition into a more economically, socially and environmentally sustainable future. And the Clean Growth Choices Consortium is working alongside each of these communities to assist them in that process and to help them develop their own transition roadmap. So as you can see on the slide, the partners in that consortium are the University of Southern Queensland, James Cook University, CSIRO, and the Co-efficiency Group. So just some background on this webinar. It's not surprising given the rise in demand for food-related travel and I guess in some cases the economic decline in some of Queensland agricultural resources, that some of the communities in this project see tourism as a possible way to revitalise and diversify their economies. The communities are finding that there's a lot of potentially interested stakeholders beyond just the producers. As you can see, that includes food and accommodation, other service providers, tour operators, and of course the councils. So in terms of the drivers, the communities can see that there's a demand for ag and food experiences. So I guess now more than ever, people can see a real connection between food with agriculture, and they're really interested in how it is being produced. There's varying degrees of confidence between the different communities about whether they have the right attributes. So that could be, engaged producers, might be natural assets, historical landmarks, or, some other man-made attraction. And some of the communities also are really strong in the area of innovation. So they've got sustainable ag or ag tech community or niche products, and others are less so. And finally, they're also faced with a number of hurdles. So these can be things like uncertainty about how to brand themselves, what are the current and possible markets, how do we access those markets, what skills do the stakeholders need? So tourism probably isn't the traditional day job. And along with that is, how do you balance agritourism with their other demands, which must be producing food. They're interested in how agritourism might be affected by weather events. So you've got the droughts and floods, and if you're up in North Queensland, you've got seasons. And also how their actual location is going to affect how successfully they're going to be able to transition to agri-tourism. So that might be a driver, and it might also be a hurdle. So basically, they're finding they've got all these stakeholders and drivers and hurdles, and they're all interacting in quite complex ways and very town or regionally specific ways. So to give us some guidance today on how communities can work through some of these complexities, we've got Dr. Michelle Thompson. So Michelle's a lecturer at Central Queensland University, and she's been researching a number of communities in Australia that have been actually going through or have gone through this transition process. So her research has given us some really practical insights that we believe the communities in transition could really benefit from. So it's with great pleasure that I now hand over to Michelle, who's going to present for about 30 minutes, and then we'll have some questions. So please fill in the Q&A section at the bottom of your screen if you've got a question, and we'll devote 15 minutes at the end of the presentation to answering some of those questions. So a big welcome to you, Michelle.
Great. Thank you very much, Nicole, for that introduction, and good afternoon, everybody. As mentioned, my name's Michelle, and I'm currently a lecturer at Central Queensland University, and I've got a real interest in researching regional tourism in particular, but focusing on that agri-tourism and food and wine tourism development. So I've been part of a number of different projects looking at different regions around Australia, but a large project I was involved with was really looking at how agritourism develops and what are the drivers, but also the barriers to that development. In addition to that, I just mentioned that one of my first roles or earlier was as an extension officer for the Sustainable Tourism CRC, and what we were doing there was running workshops very much around this topic, looking at how property owners and landholders and farmers could diversify into tourism. So what we'll be talking about today is sort of condensed into a half hour from what would have been almost a whole day workshop where we can go into things in a little bit more detail. And before that, I grew up on a small farm on the tablelands, on the Atherton tablelands in Queensland. So I've always had a bit of agriculture. It's in my blood, and I seem to have come back to it in a very different way. Oops. So we'll just start at the beginning, of course, and think about what agritourism is and what it means for regional and rural communities. And you all have a keen interest in this today, but tourism can be an opportunity for regions to diversify, but often communities can encounter a number of different barriers. So what we're trying to do is identify those barriers and help you to develop the drivers needed to develop agritourism where you are. So today we're going to talk about that through one particular little case study of the Atherton tablelands in Australia, which I'm sure most of you will be familiar with. The other thing I'd like to mention to provide some context to today is that the main drivers and barriers that we'll be talking about came out of previous research that I did as well, and we looked at development of 2 food and wine regions in Australia. So we're able to learn these lessons and hopefully share some of the insights with you today. So a good place to start is to really think about what agritourism is and what it means, that concept and term means to you and perhaps to other people listening in today. And we all might have very different ideas about agritourism, what it involves, who is involved in this, but that can also differ too in terms of thinking about it from a visitor or a tourist's perspective. So there's no wrong answers here, but it just goes to show there's a range and diversity around agritourism. It has many definitions, but at its core, it's really comprised of those businesses, the activities and the experiences that provide an opportunity for connection between tourists with the agriculture in your regions. So it could be something that happens on farm or on your properties, but it can also be something that connects people with the agriculture within your region more generally. So it usually takes place in 3 main forms. So through products, through people, and its places. So in addition to providing fresh produce perhaps and value-added products, but also experiences that could take place on farm, agritourism is a way for you to connect with visitors as well. So people are really interested in perhaps different foods or different agricultural processes, but you're the person they want to hear from as well. So they get to hear it from the farmers and the producers and your families. They want to know about your way of life and also about community life more generally within the town or region that you're in. And within that, you're operating within a broader natural backdrop and agricultural landscape as well. So agritourism is about the places and the aspects that make each of your regions unique and aesthetically pleasing as well, because it's the geography and the landscape that provides you with the base to produce the agriculture, but also that resource can then be used for tourism. So thinking about what agritourism is, we can now start talking about how it's developed. And the key thing to remember here is to think about agritourism, but not operating in isolation from anything else. So if you're looking to develop your own agritourism business, that's really fantastic. But you'll also need to think about how you connect with perhaps your neighbours, but within the region more broadly, how you connect and complement other tourism offerings in the region, and also where agritourism fits as well. So we need to think about agritourism happening on farms and more broadly about how the region as a whole can come together through tourism, but through agritourism too. So again, reiterating that point, it's about connections and interactions that of a number of different complex factors that, as Nicole mentioned, provide opportunities, but also may present barriers at different times. So what we're thinking about doing and need to do is develop a bundle of activities within regions. So it's developing a number of agritourism experiences, but using those to complement existing tourism product, like your nature or your heritage and your culture, and also combining that with other aspects of tourism. So being able to keep people fed and watered, so to speak, and thinking about where they can be accommodated if they're staying overnight, and providing shopping opportunities and so on. So it's really a key aspect in thinking about agritourism is to think about where it fits within the agricultural region that you're in. So what role does tourism have within your region more broadly? So you're all thinking about embarking on this adventure into agritourism, and it's time to ask some pretty big questions before we get started on the drivers and barriers. So the first question to really think about and work through is if you want to develop tourism, and the answer to that might be no, but it's probably a yes because you're all here listening in today. So once you've determined that you do want tourism, it's really important to think about what that's going to look like, what shape it will take, how you're going to develop it, and what type of tourism that you want to develop. Moving on from that, it's then time to think about what you have to offer and whether that's something that tourists want to come and see, whether that's going to be compelling enough to get tourists perhaps to stop in your particular town or region, or even to go off their normal drive route to come out and see you and spend a day or spend a weekend within your particular township, enjoying the experiences you have on offer. So this is really thinking about what you want to be able to supply, the resources that you have, and how that matches or meets with demand. Is that a desirable and appealing aspect that visitors want to see and will make them stop, stay, and play in your region? From there, it's then a matter of looking at the barriers, but also identifying how you can develop the drivers to help overcome the barriers that are presented in all regions. Excuse me. So just touching on that point of supply and demand before we move on, agritourism development or any tourism development needs to happen and be developed in line with demand. So when you're thinking about what you're going to do and the resources you have, it's important to firstly identify the current tourism product. So you may have existing tourism product in your region, and through looking at that particular inventory, it might be the nature, it might be historical and heritage elements, it might be the townscape that you have that's unique. So looking at all of those particular aspects, along with the new opportunities that you feel can be provided, and it could be through agritourism, but other aspects as well. In addition to that, you need to have a look and think about the supporting infrastructure that's required. So you can have some great experiences in town, but you'll also perhaps need some cafes that are going to be open on weekends, that people can enjoy some local food in perhaps. It's about having shopping opportunities that display different things for different markets, and it could be again another way of showcasing what the region has on offer. It could be things like antiques, might be a unique way of appealing to a key market, as well as accommodation too. So in line with thinking about supply, you need to think about demand. Who it is your target market. Who are the visitors and tourists coming to your region? And for a number of regional areas throughout Australia, it's the drive market by and large that's going to be an important and key market for you. So when you think about the drive market, it's important to keep in mind where people are coming from and where they're driving to. So looking at their travel patterns, as well as what is interesting or sparks a motivation in the drive market to go and investigate certain places that may be a little bit more off the beaten track and that they find intriguing. So thinking about what do they want and how does that align with what we have to offer, as well as thinking about how and where they access their information. So when you're thinking about communicating your message and marketing what you have, it's important to know how people access their information, whether it's in visitor information centres in your town or in the neighbouring town, whether it's having a web presence and through social media, or whether it's through other channels as well. So it's being able to communicate that message in a way that you can effectively target that particular audience. The other thing to keep in mind at this stage too is to think about these aspects and be able to, when you're developing tourism, think about it and look at your own backyard through the eyes of the tourist. So what is it that they will see about your town as they come through? What is it that they will find appealing? And that will help you to better understand and perhaps provide that infrastructure and the key attractions that can help develop tourism in your area. So I think that's a really key point. As we look around and we see, the banks and the old buildings, and that's a part of our everyday. But for other people, it can be a really fascinating aspect of how regional communities live, seeing open spaces and different types of farming and agriculture and so on, particularly if they're coming from a city life. So having thought of through all those issues, let's move on now to the barriers and the drivers of agritourism. So through the work that I've done, I've identified there's 6 main types of barriers that destinations are likely to encounter. They can be economic, environmental, sociocultural or community related, as well as barriers around how you develop and diversify a product for tourism, and things like administration and regulatory barriers as well. So we'll investigate those a little bit more detail through the case study. But if you're sitting there now thinking about all of the sort of hurdles you might be facing, they probably fit into 1 or 2 of these 6 key categories here. So to overcome those hurdles, there are 6 key steps or drivers that help agritourism develop. And the first of those is geography. So it's thinking about the landscape and what it provides in terms of transforming that agricultural resource that you have into a tourism product or experience. The other thing that the geography provides in terms of the landscape is an aesthetic backdrop as well. But in addition to that, it's your location. And we'll talk a little bit more about how location acts as a driver and barrier when we look at the next couple of slides on the Atherton Tablelands. In addition to that is an ability to innovate. So it's not having something necessarily completely new, but being able to look at existing things and use them for new purposes. So again, transforming agricultural resources into tourism experiences instead of having farm tours that complement the farming and the agriculture that you have, having a little shop where people can purchase value-added products or even fresh produce in addition to what you're doing. So it's being able to look at things and develop things perhaps in a new way and in a new light. And this really comes from having passionate and motivated people involved in the businesses and in the region that you're in. That's really key in helping to drive that vision for agritourism and more broadly for what tourism means to your regions and your regional economies. The community is a really important driver in terms of agritourism transformation, and because it's the community and the culture within the community that can help support changes in this area. And the community can be, some of your best advocates and supporters of what you're trying to do in terms of business as well. Developing an appealing and regional brand was also seen to be a really key driver, and that's a part of not just having great experiences available, but letting people know that they exist. So how do you communicate that message? Where is it directed? And being able to really develop and deliver a compelling story that tells the story of your region. And that then becomes compelling enough for people to want to come and visit you and enjoy your backyard. The final driver is collaborative networks. So looking at forming collaborations and networks with others who are looking at agritourism development, but also more broadly within the tourism industry. If you've got existing product and existing support structures within your communities, And that way you can pool your resources and develop the skills and expertise really required to help this sector develop more broadly. And thinking about collaboration too, it extends beyond tourism into other industries within the community, but also thinking about collaborating with neighbouring regions so that you can refer each other on, particularly to that drive tourism market, letting people know what's happening or where your town is, perhaps in a day or two's time, so they can think about planning a visit to your place, and they know about you before they get there. So let's have a look at the Atherton Tablelands. This is just an example of a regional town and community that's developing agritourism. Like all destinations, they've faced some hurdles, but they're also making some great gains in terms of what's driving development in that region. So by working through this example, it might help you to think about how those barriers and drivers might play out in your region as well. So I'm sure you're all familiar with the Atherton Tablelands. It's inland of Cairns, which is where I'm based. It's a naturally beautiful area. They've got a lot of nature-based tourism there. It's made up of a number of small townships with an ageing population, generally speaking, and a lot of farming business as well. So the region produces a great variety and diversity of agriculture, from fruits and vegetables through to tea, coffee, and dairy products as well. And this has formed the base for them to be able to diversify and develop food tourism-based experiences. So the agri-tourism experience that provides that link back to the agriculture and the landscape. The interest in tourism has grown over a number of years because they have an international tourism destination an hour's drive away from many parts of the Tablelands, and that's Cairns. So they've got a tourist market that they're wanting to tap into, so tourism seems a logical sector to develop. So let's have a bit of a closer look at how agritourism's developed there. So if we refer back to our barriers, they have faced some challenges along the way. So some of the way the economic challenges have played out in terms of the viability of the agricultural industry. So thinking about any downturns in industry can limit at times the ability to diversify into tourism, and having access to funding to invest in new ventures has often been difficult as well. The region, like all regions, is subject to environmental impacts, things like seasonality, access to water, and even natural disasters and things are out of the control of the region, like a number of these barriers are, but something to try and work around. In terms of the community and the sociocultural aspects, it's drawing from a very small population base in terms of having local support for agri-tourism businesses in addition to the tourist base. So what we find in, say, a number of famous wine regions around Australia, they've got a much larger metropolitan base. So the Hunter Valley draws on Sydney, and similar with the wine regions around Melbourne. They've got a larger local population, which means that they can help support those tourism destinations through seasonality changes and so on. So for a place like the Atherton Tablelands and for regions who are further away from that metropolitan base, that can make it a little bit more difficult. So we're relying on a smaller population base here who's largely unaware of the food offering and diversity on the Tablelands. And in conversations I've had through other research we do, through local surveying here of tourists, people often say, oh, I have to come back to Cairns, you know, the Atherton Tablelands is there and I never knew all that existed. I need to come back for another whole week just to spend on the Tablelands. So being able to communicate that message is really important. And again, thinking about and appreciating what it is that you have from the local level as well. So what do tourists see? What are the fascinating things about your region that we, as locals, live with every day and can tend to take for granted or undervalue in terms of their tourism use? So that leads us into the next point in terms of product. They've got a great range of product to draw on from their agricultural resources, but not so much recognised for its tourism value. And we're seeing that starting to change, but that's something that other regions might be struggling with too in terms of that transition. Accommodation's an interesting one for the Tablelands as well. They've got some accommodation up there. But if they want to house more people, more tourists overnight, there's been issues around developing and diversifying that accommodation base. And of course, they've got administrative and regulatory boundaries as well. So things like being able to change the core use of the land from agricultural base to a tourism base in the past has created hurdles in terms of planning regulations and perhaps using a building or transforming its purpose for a B&B. So it tends to bring in the highest level of planning in that particular instance. So it's thinking about what that means and having the support services available at that local government level. The other interesting thing with the Tablelands, and you may encounter this as well, is as a region, if I say the Atherton Tablelands to you, you'll all think about a particular region and be able to visualise it, but that region is cut across two councils. So a council boundary doesn't align with the tourism region boundary, so to speak, and that can potentially cause issues around each council's focus or rules and regulations around tourism development. The important thing to keep in mind here is that tourists don't see boundaries. They don't see the administrative boundaries and the regulatory boundaries. They just see a region. So it hasn't, it's something to keep in mind that you might come across as you're moving through tourism development, but really interesting factor. And then regulatory frameworks, of course, those big things like in insurance and OH&S, when you've got people on a working property that bring to light those changes. So in terms of drivers, how do these drivers help them overcome some of these barriers? The region, it supports a great amount of product diversity through its geography. So we've got diversification into a number of different sectors. The interesting thing here in terms of geography, it's very close to that international tourist destination. But the thing to keep in mind here too is that the Atherton Tablelands as a result is seen as a day trip. So people might go up there, drive around for the day and come back and base themselves in Cairns. So that close proximity drives a day trip market, but it can also be a hindrance in terms of developing that overnight market, interestingly enough. So if you're in a region or a destination, a town that's 2 or 3 hours from another key base, you might feel very disadvantaged, but that can work in your favour and become an advantage if you have the attractions and the experiences that are compelling enough that will encourage visitors to come and stay a whole weekend perhaps or overnight in your particular town or region. So that's where geography and understanding your location and how you can use those resources comes into play. In terms of innovation, the Atherton Tablelands are very innovative. They've diversified. They've got their cheese and chocolate factories up there. Coffee's happening. So things are starting to be to bubble on, and it's as a result of the passion and the drive of the local people and the agritourism business leaders in the region. Where they go to from here now is further developing that into having a vision for the region and understanding what the role of agritourism is within the regional economy and working with the council in terms of better understanding that role as well. And perhaps also having a champion for the agritourism sector in the region that they can hold up, or who can lead the sector through further development if that's where they're choosing to go. So if we think about the Barossa, one example of a great local champion there is Maggie Beer. So she's very involved with tourism in the region, with the food particularly, because it is a wine region. But having somebody like that can also help in being an ambassador for the region, but in the branding as well. The community and the culture is very supportive of tourism, although tourism is probably not as well understood. So there's opportunities here to further create understanding within the community, because then they become your local ambassadors. If they run into, say, a person with their RV on the street who's looking for directions, and they say, "Oh, where's the local lavender farm? I'm looking for the lavender shop." they'll say, oh, that's down the road and turn this way, and how long are you in town for? And don't forget to try and visit the local cafe. They've got all this local food on offer as well. So they can be marketing and a part of the welcoming committee, if you like, for visitors into your towns and your communities. And they're really important too in helping to support those businesses when it may be out of the tourism season, because they're there all year round. In terms of branding as well, it's very interesting to have a look at the recent visitor guide for the Atherton Tablelands. They've got a visitor guide, which is either on the web or a hard copy, where you can have a look at all the towns and the activities and the things to do that helps promote the region. And they've started to transition now into promoting experiences or perhaps a food trail, and they've started telling their story. What is their story for the Tablelands? What is the compelling story that's going to attract people to stay longer in the Tablelands, to enjoy not just the waterfall circuit, but go to Lake Bureen Tea House and then stay to B&B overnight and go somewhere else the next day. So it's about having that packaging of product and a bundle of attributes that help keep people in the region. The final aspect that they're doing is working on the networks and collaboration. So building that greater capacity that helps in pooling resources that can go into marketing and branding, but also in helping each other as well. So developing a little marketing trail or a heritage trail or a food trail and using that for marketing. And I think there's, in tourism, nobody can go it alone. So the thing to think about is partnering with others that can complement your experience or your business. So thinking about how someone might have cheese, someone else might have chocolate, but somebody else might have a great tour to do as well. So where is it that you can link in and complement the nature-based tourism product or the heritage aspects, along with that agritourism too? So thinking and seeing collaborators rather than competitors. And just talking on that point, these are just some images I've pulled down from the web that show the different types of activities, but the businesses, the agritourism businesses in the region. And what I was referring to earlier was businesses promoting themselves, but they're working together through collaboration, and they've now promoting a food trail as well as a part of their visitor guide. So that's available on the web, and they're shifting that idea now. Instead of still promoting places, but they're promoting this idea of experiences. So people can create their own one-day itinerary if they'd like, based on that food trail. The other thing that's happening is they've got operators coming in now, putting together a diversity of product, packaging it up and taking people around the region to sample the cheeses and the chocolates, but it could be the tea and the coffee and the little local distilleries as well. So it's a really great way to see how businesses are leading the way, and there's this mass happening now where they're starting to come together more so, and we're moving into a more whole of region approach. So some final remarks to finish up really. The key take-home messages for today would be understanding what is meant by agritourism for your particular region, what it means to you, but what it means for the region more broadly, and that need to have a whole of region approach. So thinking about agritourism development and how that fits into tourism that is happening in your particular region. Where does it fit? The other thing to focus on is, when developing up agritourism experiences, is to also think about the demand for those experiences. So matching that supply and demand. And again, providing the connections, connecting with tourists, connecting and interacting with others within the agritourism sector and within the tourism system within your region, as well as with other industries and the community more generally. But in addition to that, thinking about neighbouring communities and connections as well. Because if in the drive tourism market, you're looking at people on the ground moving from place to place, you can be advertising what you have in your own town, but what you might need to do is have brochures in the towns around you, so that when people are planning their itineraries, they can plan a visit to your township in a day or two's time. So thinking about how you can get people through all of these avenues to stop, to stay, and to engage with the experiences you have on offer. So that really leads me back into this slide. The very next steps are to take a step back and think about, in terms of agritourism development, what you have, the resources you have, and how appealing or attractive they are. So what's happening in the market that you're looking at, and identifying that target market, and thinking about and seeing your region, its attractions, its resources through the eyes of the tourist. So to finish up, I've got here some information sources, because thinking about this and being able to identify your market is a really key step. So it's probably best on this slide to work actually from the bottom up, but it just gives you an insight and some access and links to available information. So there's information that Nicole has available on the Communities in Transition webpage with a number of agritourism resources there. You might also find that your councils have done reports or have perhaps a strategy or are thinking about agritourism as well, and tourism's role in the community and the region. So there might also be other consultancy reports or in similar industry reports available online. So it could be a matter of a simple web search. But there might be conversations being had already at your Chamber of Commerce, or thinking about having a look at what's available in visitor information centres too in your region. The Australian Regional Tourism Organisation are actually currently conducting a scoping study at Agritourism, which might be of interest to you, but they also are great supporters of regional tourism throughout Australia. So they may have access to further resources, including a local government study as well. Tourism and Events Queensland will be a great resource for everybody. They provide not only information to visitors, but their corporate site has a number of resources available for those in the industry. So from here, you'll be able to determine where your township is in terms of its regional tourism profile. So there's about 13 or 14 tourism regions in Queensland. You'll be able to find out where your township sits, but also see who the visitors are and the size of the market that's already come into your particular region, and perhaps even to your town. They also have a range of specialised reports available, and there's one there on the Drive tourism market, but they have other ones too, and they've run some storytelling workshops and materials that may also be available. And it's a great resource to have a look and think about where your region fits and what's happening in terms of visitor numbers. And Tourism Research Australia and Tourism Australia have similar resources at the national level. So it's worth having a look at those as well. So you've got some context, but Tourism and Events Queensland may be where you find some more relevant data. Look, thank you very much for taking the time to listen in today. I hope the Times, although it's been brief, has provided some insights and some next steps for you to all think about, and some direction to take you from here. So I might hand back over to Nicole now that we've reached the end of the presentation.
Thanks, Michelle, for that. Really interesting, and we've got quite a few questions here. So the first one is, is one big experience key, or can a region build an business experience around a number of those?
Oh, that's a really good question. Look, having a one big experience is a great attractor. And if you think about a pyramid cut into layers, almost like steps, you might have a key iconic experience for your particular town or region, and that's the big ticket item that brings people in and can draw people in. But in addition to that, it's really important to have a number of other supporting or layers of tourism as well. So you might have a number of other attractions or experiences that can hold people there, because if you've got one key experience, it might only be a half-day experience. So if you think about tourists, particularly drive tourists, they might head to a destination in the morning. So you've got between breakfast and morning tea, and then morning tea and lunch. So you can fit 1 or 2 activities in there. But how do you get them then to stay after lunch? Because if you can hold them there, you've got them for an afternoon slot as well. So having a number of experiences is also important, and it's probably demonstrated really well in a little regional town in South Australia. They've got one key item that they have, which is their heritage trail, but they've got all these other fascinating little things that can keep people in town. They've got some great cafes, 2 really fantastic restaurants for a community that's probably only 1,000 people. And it's about how you keep people and hold them there to investigate all of the aspects you have of your town. And they're on a drive tourism market route as well. So you can have one big ticket item, but you also need the other aspects too, and that includes the supporting infrastructure.
And so I guess on a similar sort of vein, I've got a question here. What do you think about organising an annual regional event in terms of kickstarting some more regular agritourism?
Look, I think having a regional and an annual event is a great way to bring the community together and to use it to either extend or bring attention to your region. And I can think of here on the Tablelands, they have the Feast of the Senses and a couple of other events as well that help keep that foodie presence or raise the interest in the food presence. And it's enjoyed by locals and visitors as well. So I think it's a great way to be able to have an annual event, become known for it as well. It draws people in. And while people are there, they can explore some of those other avenues and aspects too. So events are a great way to recognise an important time of year like harvest time, and also to extend or add to your tourism season and extend that and increase visitation that way if you've already got people coming to your area. So that's a really good way to do it, and it brings everybody get together. You see what you're all doing, and it helps develop those networks too.
And a fairly practical question. So have you seen how farmers manage their labour force to deal with fluctuations in demand at different times of the year?
Yeah, that's a really good question and a really good point. It's difficult at times, especially if your peak harvesting time or your busiest time on the agricultural calendar coincides with the tourism season as well. So I think it's probably a matter of thinking about your agritourism venture and how big you want that to be, but also how you're going to resource it. Just trying to think of some examples. I know in terms of labour force, it was very difficult in other regions I've been in just to get labour in for, say, the picking of the vines, harvesting vines in a wine region in Western Australia, in addition to making sure that people were there at a cellar door, for instance. So something to work through and think about in terms of the role of your agritourism venture within your broader agribusiness. And something that I think will change. Everyone will struggle with, but it will diversify from business to business. It's a bit hard to be specific there.
And so, Michelle, how important do you think it is that your town is on an established circuit drive?
Look, it can be really important. It helps if you've already on an established drive route because you've got people moving through, and you're then looking at maybe identifying who those people are and encouraging them to stop and stay rather than drive through. It can be a help. Again, if you're off, not on a main route and off a little bit, it's going to be really important to have something that's compelling in the first place that people will go off the beaten track to get to. And the other big key there is letting people know that you have it. So it's not a matter of just developing that, like the build it and they will come, developing that, you've got to let people know that you have it. So it might be, for those off the beaten track a little bit and newer to tourism, it might be a good idea to work with other established towns along that drive tourism route to be able to then say, well, organise a detour or organise some collaboration so that people will divert and then go back onto the tourism route and spend some time in your region. That's where the collaborations and the marketing become really important.
Okay. And so last question, if you don't have an obvious, unique attraction, what are your thoughts about creating one? So I'm assuming something like the Big Banana or something like that. What are your thoughts? So obviously, the town doesn't feel like they have a particularly unique attraction.
Yeah, I think the starting point would be to come together and have a look at your town, perhaps through the eyes of the visitor. I don't know if you're not sure what that is, and tourism isn't currently happening in the town, it may be that you need to have a look at that inventory and think about what it is that makes you unique or different, and perhaps looking at the different types of things you could do, but also thinking about where your fit is in terms of tourism that's happening around you. So maybe look at the neighbouring towns and the product and whether there's something there that you can complement that with, where there's something missing. Not every town is going to be a destination in its own right, but there are opportunities through tourism to be able to stop and say cater for those people wanting to pick up supplies on the way through to somewhere else, get a really nice cup of coffee, or sit back and have an afternoon somewhere as well. So it's working out, perhaps having a look at what you have and putting, through the eyes of the tourist, perhaps looking at what's happening around you and the types of visitors that are going to other places, and then seeing perhaps where your fit is from there. It may not be agriculturally based. It could be a part of your history and heritage. It could be some of your natural backdrop. So all of those things. So I think it comes back to looking at it and really thinking about, if it's in that instance, why you want tourism and what you would be developing and how that fits a need within the market. So back to the big questions there.
Okay. So one last question snuck in. So what do you think about the impact of the landscape affected by drought in regards to agritourism?
Yeah, I've seen the devastating effects of natural disasters, particularly on the Atherton Tablelands and along the coastline. So very different scenario with cyclones coming through in terms of recovery. And I think it's interesting. I think, look, it provides a backdrop that can highlight the realities of living on the land and the drought that that farmers are going through at the moment. So in that way, the landscape has provided a change. Whether you're able to harness that in some way may depend on what you have in mind, particularly if you're still working out there. There might be other pressures that you've got to face. I know that here, after a cyclone, we did some survey work, and Cyclone Larry, I think, went through right up into the Atherton Tablelands and hadn't been so far inland before, and devastated the region. So we had, trees down and lots of damage down the coast as well to the communities, infrastructure, etc. We surveyed tourists and they said, oh, it's so devastating, and we feel for the people. But their feedback in terms of the natural landscape was, the landscape's really been hard hit, etc. So we had a look at that, and they did notice the impact at that time, directly after that event. 12 months later, though, everything had recovered. We resurveyed another set of visitors, And they said, and we said, what did you think of your visit to the tablelands? Oh, it was great. It was fantastic. For the locals, you could see where the recovery was still taking place to the natural environment. But for the visitor, they didn't have anything to compare that to. So in that instance, if you've got a disaster like that, it can have a devastating short-term impact to your visitor market. But in the longer term, it was able to recover. With the drought, it's different circumstance again, because you'll be able to see those impacts longer term. So I think that, I don't know if that answers the question, but I think, look, through tourism, you can provide an insight into what's happening in drought-affected areas, and it provides a different perspective of the landscape. And whether that can help support communities in some way could be advantageous. So I think it's looking at those particular aspects, and it probably speaks to a greater narrative around the nature and what's happening as well, the natural environment and what's happening in terms of those climatic changes.
Okay. Thanks, Michelle. So that's all the questions. And thank you for joining us today. I really appreciate your time and your expertise.
No, thank you very much.
All right. And thank you, listeners, for listening in as well. Goodbye. Oh, there was another question here. Sam Thorpe is encouraging tourists now to inject some